Back in Neverwinter, Sylvie perched on Maisie and requested a full bombardment on the target. Shabby quickly answered that the message was passed along, remarked that the shelling would begin in 5 minutes, and urged them to stay safe. Sylvie nodded, then glanced toward Takara. From up there, she could clearly see the ruins, so she told Maisie to gain more altitude. Maisie let out a sharp cry and surged higher, and moments later, the shells began landing. Each blast dug huge craters into the ground, clouds of dust and smoke erupting as the shells blanketed the front lines. Sylvie could see demons crushed to pieces, and those burrowed underground forced into a panicked scramble. Sylvie reported that the enemy had shown itself, then called in updated positions, declaring that they should continue firing at their present angle. However, that's when the high-ranking demon suddenly charged straight for them. Sylvie quickly contacted Lightning, told her to return, and explained that the demon slayer was on the move. Maisie also spun around without hesitation, and the two of them shot away from the airspace as fast as they could. The pursuing demon suddenly gave up the chase, then stared helplessly as another round of artillery fire wiped out more of its underlings. Before long, Lightning caught up and joined them. The demon, consumed by rage as it watched its forces being slaughtered, glared at the three girls before abandoning its troops entirely and streaking off in a different direction. Maisie glanced at Sylvie and asked if they should do one more sweep. Sylvie glanced at Lightning, then slowly shook her head and decided they were done for the day, remarking that they had already scouted a 6-kilometer radius and that was more than enough to guarantee the engineering team's safety for the next few days. Down in Station 9's underground command post, Sylvie was marking the areas they had checked on the map when Ferlin came over with a drink. He tells her that she had worked hard and observed that it looked like Lady Edith's plan was working. Sylvie took the drink and agreed. Then she asked where Lady Edith was. Ferlin explained that she had already taken orders from His Majesty and left with Axe on the Seagull back to Neverwinter. He smiled and added that it must be about time for the final War Council to plan the decisive battle. Meanwhile, back in Neverwinter, Roland greeted Axe and asked him how his first trip on the Seagull felt. Axe admitted that although it was very fast, it was a bit too thrilling for him, especially during takeoff and landing. Even though he had watched plenty of times before, riding it himself felt a lot shakier than he expected. Still, he declared loudly that he'd do his best to overcome the fear so Roland wouldn't have to worry. Our boy thought to himself that even his most battle-hardened right-hand man wasn't immune to a touch of fear of heights. Axe thought for a moment and then declared that as soon as the fighting settled down, he'd spend his free time watching the magic shadow until he got used to flying. Roland couldn't help but smile, thinking that was exactly Axe's style. Up next was Edith, who licked her lips and simply remarked that it was great. Roland was a bit surprised by her casual comment but decided not to dwell on it. Instead, he announced that since they were all back, it was time to head to the meeting room and begin the final preparations for the war. By then, all the senior officials in Neverwinter had assembled. After nearly 6 months of building and pushing forward, the first railway line across the fertile plain had advanced to less than 60 kilometers from the Takira ruins. Once Station 10 was completed, the First Army would finally be able to strike directly at the enemy entrenched there. The Torch Plan had consumed more manpower and materials than any military campaign in the past 4 years. Nearly 80% of the steel produced in the Furnace District had been forged into rails for one strategic goal, which was to stop the demons from erecting an obelisk before the Red Moon. If the fertile plain were shrouded in red mist, demons could spill past the mountains into their territory at any time. That would stretch the front lines and force the First Army to face enemies that no longer had distance working against them. Given humanity's disadvantage in numbers, that was hardly an ideal way to begin the decisive fight. On the other hand, if they seized Takira first, the demons would have no choice but to grow their obelisk near the other two ruins, both too far north to pose an immediate threat to the 4 great kingdoms. And Roland believed that would give humanity at least another 400 years, maybe more. Of course, reality rarely followed the plan perfectly. The appearance of the demon slayer had forced a major adjustment. The curse prevented any type of healing, so even a small wound could become fatal. Roland remarked that Lightning was fine and her recovery rate nearly matched the spread of the infection. On the other hand, Leaf wasn't so lucky. According to Ash's observations and reports, Leaf's condition was worsening. That was why they had to take down the demon slayer at Takira. Edith then began speaking, noting that according to the staff department's projections, if the demon slayer sensed the position was hopeless, there was a 90% chance it would retreat. Even without much hard proof, the demon had kept a healthy distance so far. Aletheia agreed as well, pointing out that being fearless didn't mean rushing into a pointless death. On that point, demons weren't all that different from humans, and concluded that a high-ranking commander was far too valuable to go down with its troops. Edith added that this was why they had to take the fight to the demon slayer directly and cut it off along its escape route. Luckily, they already had their movements locked down, and they'd pulled off similar ambushes before. She believed that a long-range sniper shot was clearly the safest option, and glanced toward Andrea as she spoke. Meanwhile, Tilly raised a concern, saying whether a single bullet would be enough to kill the demon slayer was still unknown, and they wouldn't get a second chance. She asks what if the demon had already noticed the sniper rifle and deliberately avoided it on the way back. She noted that given past battles, their understanding of firearms was well beyond what they'd first thought. Edith answered that her department had already considered this. They planned to use the Stone of God's punishment to make the bullet. Even if it didn't kill the target outright, it would take away the demon's flight ability. The only issue was that smaller stones were too brittle to survive a gun's discharge. But Andrea's weapon had a larger caliber, so they could probably make it work. On top of that, she'd already checked with Agatha that demon blood could greatly increase the strength of the stones. At the same time, they had already started testing this theory. Alethea brightened up then, remarking that she liked the idea of using their own blood to kill them, and told Edith she was only the second mortal who'd ever caught her interest. Edith then moved on to the next point, saying they needed a backup pursuit team. Wendy noted with a sigh that Lightning was the only one who could keep up with the Demon Slayer, but she also couldn't take it on alone. Edith wagged a finger and pointed out that there was something even faster than Lightning, and further explained that the seagull in a dive is potentially faster. Tilly quickly caught on and noted Edith was proposing to put the God Punishment witches on board. Edith agreed and explained that a magic suppression field was as good as a Stone of God's Punishment. With 10 or so witches on the plane, they'd have a real shot at dragging the demon down or even killing it. Even if they failed to finish it off, the sniper team could catch up and deliver the last blow. Roland nodded, concluding that this plan was probably their best bet. But he guessed Ashes would never agree to have Tilly face the Demon Slayer directly. Tilly cut him off, calmly declaring she'd convince Ashes herself, then added that she would be going too. Wendy looked at Roland nervously, and clearly she didn't want to see anything go wrong. Tilly assured her there was nothing to worry about. She believed this was hardly different from their usual work. By the time the Demon Slayer even realized the seagull was there, the Takira witches would already have it too busy to escape. With a smile, she told everyone to rest easy, promising she wasn't like Ashes and she'd never bite off more than she could chew. Edith then pointed to the map and explained the final part of the plan, which was the ambush spot. She commented that without red mist, a high-ranking demon wouldn't last long, so its most instinctive move would be to retreat to refill its air tank. That meant the perfect ambush site was somewhere along that path. Alethea jumped in with a good suggestion. She asked if anyone remembered that one witch who had once slipped deep behind enemy lines. Tilly rubbed her forehead and muttered that she'd actually scolded her before for wasting a rare magic stone. But Alethea believed the place right behind the Takira ruins would give them a perfect vantage point. Once they get everything set up, they could monitor the place and see everything coming. Roland finally gave his approval, and he announced that in the next few days, Axe and Edith would stay to nail down the ambush plan. Just then, Alethea wanted him to come over, whispering to him that the cube research had taken a big step forward. The scene shifted to the research lab, where Celine pressed her tendrils against the magic cube. She noted that several parts of the cube had an unusually long history. Roland took a closer look and admitted that the components did look worn out, though he was more surprised that she could now dismantle the cube without damaging it. But if the parts were in her hands, why was the cube still glowing? That's when Celine lit up with excitement and explained that the ones currently on the cube weren't the originals and further explained that they were replicas she crafted herself. The fact that they were functioning meant they were effective substitutes. Roland, pleasantly stunned, grabbed her tendril and praised her, declaring she was incredible. It had barely been 3 months, and he'd assumed it would take at least a year to make progress like this. Celine explained that the structure of the cube was far simpler than a magic core, and the delicate components inside were much easier to handle thanks to wicks from the sleeping curse. Now, with roughly 500 pieces of materials of the right quality, she was confident she could produce a fully functional replica. Roland tells her that the garrison in Daching Port should have already started following his orders to collect what was needed, and they'd likely get a response soon. Celine then tilted her head, asking if she could have a reward, but clarified that it would, of course, help further her research. Curious, Roland asked what she wanted. Celine remarked that she needed someone to help her because her sisters had a better understanding of the knowledge of the dream world. Having them self-study was proving far too difficult, and apparently, the dream world had schools and teachers, and she believed in better systems that might just work in their favor. So, she hoped Roland could send some of her sisters to school. During the night, Roland recapped the day's events to Anna, sharing the details of the War Council, especially the decision to modify weapons for bullets made out of Stone of God's Punishment. He said this was now their top priority and that both Agatha and Andrea would be assisting him on it. Anna smiled and teased that it felt like the work never ended. She remarked that from aircraft parts to internal combustion engines, frontline railways, and many other projects, she feels that there was always more to do. Honestly, she was starting to envy Celine, saying her tendrils were so much more convenient than her fire. Roland groaned in protest, saying he had zero interest in cuddling a giant flesh blob at night. And besides, Anna wasn't just the head of the engineering department, she was Greycastle's queen, always needing to appear in front of the people. Still, he promised to find someone to help lighten her load. Anna smiled, wrapped her arms around him, and said she looked forward to it, but right now, she wanted a different kind of reward. What happened next? Well, you can probably guess. By the time Roland opened his eyes again, he had already returned to the dream world. A knock came from the door, and when he opened it, 3 young witches greeted him with a cheerful hello. Roland recognized Donnan right away, but it was the pink-haired girl who introduced herself as Milan. Her ability, she explained, was imitation, and once linked by her magic, she could flawlessly mirror any movement the target made. This was her second time entering the dream world. The other witch, named Dodo, has the ability to create an invisible pocket. In short, she could store objects in a magically hidden pouch. She admitted it might not sound very useful, but promised she wouldn't let Lady Alethea down. The mission had already been explained by Alethea, so Roland simply instructed the girls to speak as little as possible and just follow his lead. But just as he was about to step out, his phone buzzed, and it was Garcia, asking him to drop by. Roland headed next door and opened the door to Garcia's apartment. The first thing she said was congratulations. Then she handed him a document and explained that he had officially become a martial fighter. All that remained was his signature. Roland skimmed through the contract while Garcia pointed out that it also included a hunter license, a rare credential given only to those with exceptional talent in combat and a commitment to fighting the fallen. She emphasized that there were fewer than 10 martial fighters in the city with such a license. To her, this was both a sign of the association's trust and a heavy responsibility. She hoped Roland would stick with this path until humanity claimed its final victory. Then she asked why he needed her. Roland asked her to come with him for a moment. Though puzzled why it couldn't be said here, Garcia followed anyway. But when they stepped into his room and she saw the 3 young girls, she froze. Then, with a shaky voice, she muttered that she should have known Roland would take this step eventually. Her eyes darted from one girl to the next, and her voice quivered as she pointed out that they were clearly children. Without missing a beat, she pulled out her phone and prepared to call the authorities. Even after a long explanation, Garcia still looked at our boy skeptically, asking if those girls leaving his room really weren't what they looked like, and were just part-time tutors. Roland patiently confirmed that she was right, adding that they were local university students hired to help tutor Zero and, along the way, assist the 3 girls. But, he admitted, this setup was only a temporary fix. Over time, the tutors would inevitably start questioning things. After all, the girls not attending school would only raise more suspicion. His only option was to switch tutors before anyone dug too deep. Garcia then connected the dots and concluded that those relatives he'd mentioned the first time he missed their meeting were actually these 3 girls. Roland sighed inwardly, wondering how she was still mad at him for ghosting her after all this time, but he kept the conversation smooth. He explained that the girls all came from the poor village where he came from. Garcia then asked if that's the case, then why don't they have any documents? Roland explained it was because of their gender. That made Garcia pause, and after a long silence, her expression softened as she remarked that now she understood. She then quietly asked if there were many like them. Roland explained that there were quite a few, though the situation had only started improving over the past decade. He added that word of his joining the Martial Fighter Association had spread back home, and the 3 girls had come seeking a chance to escape their old lives. The girls, sensing the moment, quickly added their voices, looking at Garcia with big, pleading eyes, saying they just wanted to stay and go to school. Garcia wavered, and Roland pressed on, explaining that no amount of tutoring or self-study could solve the real problem. He wanted them to have a normal life, and only Garcia could make that happen. Garcia couldn't hold their gaze, eventually sighing and, with clear reluctance, turning them down. She explained that she'd already cut ties with her family, vowing never to see her father again. On top of that, the family still wanted to tear down this district. If she returned now, they'd turn it into a spectacle, and that could fracture the protest coalition standing beside her. Roland said he understood, but Garcia surprised him by offering him a chance to speak directly. She revealed that her father would be hosting a banquet downtown tomorrow evening, inviting prominent martial fighters from the region. Though she had no intention of going, they'd still sent her an invitation, and even though it wasn't addressed to Roland, one call from her would get him in. It was obvious this was as far as Garcia herself would go. Garcia thought our boy was hesitating, so she asked if he was getting cold feet. Roland didn't back down and said he knew Garcia was doing her best, but what worried him was walking away empty-handed. To that, Garcia assured him not to worry. Her father wasn't the type to throw tantrums, and he cared only about benefits. She asserted that Roland wasn't just some ordinary person, remarking that even Prism City had started paying attention to his rise, and told him not to underestimate himself. Roland promised to do his best. Garcia reached out her hand, admitting she was genuinely happy to see him stay true to his path, and it was she confessed, who had misjudged when they first met. With a small smile, she declared she was glad to have a comrade like him fighting by her side. In the end, Garcia told Roland that if he ever needed anything, he should just say it directly, and to drop the whole Miss Garcia formalities. Roland nodded, though he was not telling the full truth to Garcia, but she was right about our boy not forgetting his goals. As evening rolled around, Dawnan couldn't hold back her excitement, asking if they were really allowed to eat anything they wanted here. Roland assured her they were, and he figured it was no different from the kind of noble banquets she must have attended back during the Federation era. But Dawnan clarified that those events were never about eating and only prominent figures got invited, and the main purpose was to make connections. She explained that no one wanted to chat with someone stuffing their face, and overindulging would only get them laughed at. Hearing that, the girls made up their minds, saying if overreading might embarrass Roland, then they'd hold back. Roland, watching them through the rearview mirror, started laughing, then tells the girls to relax, saying over here wasn't the Federation, and he wasn't Greycastle's king. Here, they were just regular people, and they could eat as they pleased. The girls lit up, bubbling with excitement, even whispering about sneaking some treats back for the other sisters. Roland agreed, saying as long as they weren't caught, but they had to stick close and not wander. Soon they arrived at a luxurious hotel. As they stepped into the grand lobby and entered the elevator, they were greeted by staff, and the girls gazed out the windows in wide-eyed amazement. They murmured that even the combined size of the three holy cities couldn't match this single city. No matter how many times they saw it, it was hard to believe ordinary mortals, without magic, had built such wonders. Milan glanced at Roland, quietly asking if the miracle building he wanted to construct also carried a commemorative meaning. Though he'd never told anyone except Anna, the witches of Takira had mostly guessed by now that he came from a place just like the dream world. When they reached the top floor, the venue was already buzzing. Guests mingled in small groups, the atmosphere lively and relaxed. The girls eagerly grabbed plates and piled on their favorite dishes, but they didn't forget to sneak extra into Dodo's invisible pouch. Watching them, Roland felt that even if this dream world brought him no personal gain, he realized he wanted to keep it going. For him, maybe it was just a hollow illusion, but for the remaining Takira witches, it was the only place they could truly feel alive. Taste, touch, smell, all the sensations stolen from them by the war against demons could only be reclaimed here. Shaking himself back to the moment, Roland began surveying the other guests. Some wore sharp suits, others came dressed in martial fighter uniforms. He recalled what Garcia once told him, that while the Martial Fighter Association was founded on noble ideals of saving the world, but ideals alone couldn't rally enough people. That was why the fighting tournaments had emerged. In less than 50 years, they had become the most watched sporting events, offering awakened fighters exposure, fame, and income. The tournaments fed countless fresh recruits into the association, and top performers gained real influence. But this rise also sparked divisions at the very top, splitting members into old and new factions. In the end, the tournaments not only didn't get scaled back, they actually expanded even further. Elsewhere in the room, a man was observing Roland, quietly asking the person beside him if they dug up any intel. The assistant murmured that Roland's background was ordinary, his connection to Garcia purely by chance, and his name absent from any tournament rankings. He added that Roland had joined the Martial Fighter Association just 3 months ago. The man thought to himself that Garcia was famously hard to approach. Those who earned her attention were almost non-existent. He couldn't help but wonder, just what had Roland done to gain her favor? His eyes drifted to Fei Yuhan, the brightest rising star in the martial fighter circle. In just 5 years, she had twice reached the finals of the tournament. Though she hadn't claimed a championship, she was already hailed as the face of the new generation. Normally, someone like her wouldn't even glance at an invite from their conglomerate. Yet here she was, attending just to check on Roland. With a smile, he began approaching her, but before he could say a word, Fei Yuhan cut him off, remarking that she'd already heard everything and told him not to repeat. The man was surprised as he hadn't realized she could catch his hushed murmurs. Meanwhile, Fei Yuhan had already turned her attention towards our boy. She quietly remarked to herself on his movements, tone, gaze, even the faint tremble of his skin, all perfectly human. And yet, his natural energy was utterly undetectable. Was this the strength of a new hunter? A fresh recruit capable of defeating a fallen one? A smile spread across her face, and she believed tonight would be anything but boring. Still, she couldn't figure out why those girls with him kept whispering about the dream world and His Majesty. She suspected some kind of role play. Either way, she figured she'd find a moment to ask them directly later. Soon, applause rippled through the room as Garcia's father appeared. Roland recognized him from photos, and the man waved casually, and Roland found himself thinking that Zero hadn't devoured Wimbledon the third after all. It seems like everyone who has been devoured must have been fully integrated into the dream world, with self-consistent memories and social ties. Whether the three-leaf family had been created around Garcia or she'd been slotted randomly into its web, it was impossible to say now. He didn't want to overthink it, and he just motioned for the girls to follow and told them to hold off on eating for now. The man wrapped up his speech with a smile and greeted the crowd, but Roland smoothly stepped forward, lifting his glass and introducing himself as Garcia's proxy for the evening. The man, clearly familiar with the name, shifted into polite business chatter. Roland then leaned in, quietly explaining there was something they needed to discuss privately. The man declined, saying he had other guests to attend to. But Roland pressed, dropping Garcia's name and asking him if he didn't want to know how his daughter was doing these days. After a moment's thought, the man agreed. They moved into a side room. Roland glanced at the butler and asked if it was fine for him to stay, explaining that what he was about to say involved the man's interests. The man assured him that the butler was family who had been on his side for decades. But then he raised an eyebrow, curious why Roland had brought 3 little girls. Roland got straight to the point, saying this was a deal. He remarked that the three girls were undocumented, and he wanted them properly registered with legal identities and enrolled in a good high school. The man thought there had to be more to it. Roland said it shouldn't be difficult for someone like him. But the man pointed out that if this was a deal, what was Roland offering in return? Without hesitation, he brought up one demand, which is that Garcia must abandon her protests against the conglomerate. Roland shook his head, calmly saying that as Garcia's friend, there was no way he could betray her like that. The man gave a soft, dismissive laugh at the word friend and began preparing to end the conversation. But Roland smoothly pulled out his hunter license. The man's expression changed instantly, then glanced at the butler, who quietly confirmed it was authentic. Now visibly surprised, he asked how Roland came to possess something like that. Roland explained that it was classified and admitted that the man didn't have clearance to know the details. All the man needed to understand was what it meant. The man slowly retrieved a cigar, commenting that it seemed his daughter had indeed met someone remarkable. Still, he pointed out, even the Martial Fighter Association was bound by law. Roland assured him this wasn't a threat, but rather just a transaction. The man put the cigar back into his pocket only to hear that Roland was offering him a rare chance to solve any of his problems, but the target had to be a criminal, someone outside official society, as well as someone who genuinely posed a threat to him. Roland added that he had his own ways of verifying those conditions and warned the man not to underestimate that. That way, the association would stay out of it, and the less they knew, the better. Even so, the man noted that if Roland was serious, 3 legal registrations hardly matched the value of what was on the table. Roland calmly pointed out that this was just a down payment, and also the first batch, then further explained that there were around 300 more waiting. The man was genuinely surprised, remarking that registering 300 undocumented people would definitely draw attention. But Roland tells him to take his time, even spread it over a few years if needed. This agreement, after all, had no expiration date. The man finally agreed that it was doable, and soon the two shook hands to seal the deal. As Roland stepped out of the room, the girls immediately crowded around him, remarking that such negotiations shouldn't be handled by a king himself. They complained that the man's attitude had been way too disrespectful, and one even admitted that if Lady Aletha had been there, she'd probably have had her sword at his throat by now. But Donan chimed in with a grin, saying that a king should get to do whatever he wants. After all, Lady Akali's never cared what others thought. Roland chuckled, shaking his head and telling them to stop calling him Your Majesty already. Donan then asked if they were heading back now. Roland explained that the banquet would likely run deep into the night, but it wouldn't be right to keep the other witches waiting too long. He told them they had another half hour to enjoy themselves. The 3 girls lit up instantly and darted back to the buffet with shining eyes, already scheming to snag more treats. Left alone, Roland leaned back slightly, lost in thought, when suddenly, something slid into his glass. He stared in surprise as words began to shimmer across the surface of his drink, telling him not to forget their deal.